So, Peter, I suggest we share the time. At first, I have some questions we have prepared, but almost. And in the second time, I suggest the audience ask you about
Yeah, that's a good idea.
your
I think
practice.
that's definitely the best idea.
So you prefer to start by the
No,
second
we'll
time?
talk a little bit, and then let's do some questions.
No problem. So the first question, from your first production, Fact One, which is displayed, to the recent Burberry rebranding, your work seemed built on a free reflection.
Okay,
Could you describe this approach?
Okay, I think what you refer to as free reflection is what I refer to as like autonomy, or kind of a degree of self-expression in the context of the work, and that varies enormously. So the poster that you refer to, Fact One, is 40 years ago. That was the first thing I did for a project that was going to become known as Factory Records. But at the time, it was just it was a gig. You know, it was what you would call these days a night. You know, it was a poster to represent 4 nights in a temporary venue in Manchester called the Factory, and the circumstances of the of the Factory project were kind of they were entirely non-commercial. Everybody involved was just taking the opportunity to do something they wanted to do. There were bands who wanted to play, and there were people who wanted to make it possible for those bands to play. There was really no money involved. There was just like an opportunity, and the moment was just after punk had happened in '76, and in the city of Manchester there had been like many venues for bands to play, but because punk was disruptive, socially disruptive, the venues all got closed down. Like for one reason or another, the venues all closed. So there was a man called Tony Wilson who believed in the new music scene, and he organized the venue. And I was at college. I was in my final year, and I heard about it, and I just went along and said, can I help? Can I do something, please? Can I be involved? And that was very much the feeling around punk. It was like a coup d'etat in youth culture, and if you were interested in what was going on, you just wanted to be involved. And you know, lots of kids bought instruments and formed groups. They couldn't play anything, but they tried. And some of them had something to say, and some of them had something to give. But nobody was thinking of making money. And of course, it's always interesting and important when there is like a moment like that. And it didn't seem very possible then, but we managed. It's even less possible now. You know, for young people to do something without any money, without any budget, that just gets more and more difficult every year. So I'm sympathetic to that problem. Anyway, we did something, and because nobody was being paid, and because nobody was in charge, there was nobody to approve anything. You know, you just did it because you could. So I made the poster that I wanted to see, and the people were happy that I did it. You know, there was no one said no one approved it. They just said, oh, they said it's late. so sorry about that. It was a bit late, but at least it existed. And at that time, my personal kind of punk moment was that I was unhappy. I was unhappy with the way the world looked. And I was very unhappy about the way the city of Manchester looked in 1978. I was at art school. The curriculum for graphic design was not something that I was happy with. I was not comfortable with the curriculum. The New York School of Visual Wit had kind of taken over graphics teaching. So the kind of Saul Bass, Milton Glaser, Seymour Schwartz, the Pushpin Studio look, the kind of the communication through a kind of a joke, had taken over the graphics curriculum in the 70s. And I found it a bit dumb. I have an appreciation of that now that I didn't have 40 years ago. And as a sort of arrogant, young person, I just fucking hated it, and I thought it was stupid. And I felt there were other ways to communicate instead of making people laugh. I was more interested in the kind of silent sort of the silent signals of style culture, what you could call semiotics, and that, in my genre of life, people were communicating through how they looked, through certain sort of signifiers, visual signifiers, and I felt that was appropriate for communications, and that all that mattered was that you had to target the audience with the right signifiers, and I wasn't going to be talking to everybody. So I was talking to 1%, and all that mattered was that the 1% got it. And in this mindset, and contrary to the school curriculum, I had discovered basically the canon of graphic history in the library one day, which was not talked about. So the whole history of graphic design and its origins in early 20th century art and modernism, it was not on the curriculum. It had been for the staff. They'd studied it in the 60s, but by the 70s, when they were teaching, they didn't think anybody was interested. And in fact, the first time that I did a piece of work, basically it's just a piece of pure typography, my tutor, he said, "Why did you do that?" It's like he just couldn't understand why I'd even done it. And I said, "Oh, you wouldn't get it." So I'd kind of, there were like one afternoon, in fact, let's say October 1977, whatever that would be, 42 years ago, in the library at Manchester Polytechnic, I found a lot of books that no one had ever talked to me about, and no one had ever shown me. And it was the history of graphics, and the history of modern graphics obviously starts, at the turn of the last century. And I saw the relationship to art, but also it introduced me to art that I didn't know. In these books, I left with like 20 books that day. And, Malevich's Black Square was in one of those books. And, I was 21. I didn't understand it, but I knew I didn't understand it, and I knew that was important, and I thought, okay, it's time for me to learn. And actually, that was that day that I took those books out was actually the day my education began, like my own education. Like when we're young, we have an education that other people give us and tell us that we have to have. And then if you're lucky, one day, there'll be something that you actually want to learn for yourself. And that's kind of what matters the most. When you actually, and that day, I realized I I realized I didn't know anything, and it was time to start to learn. So I started to learn. And I would, like, I'm sitting looking for simplicity, I'm looking in a book of the Bauhaus, and at the same time I'm looking through the window at what was modern Manchester. And I was really angry. Because I could see that the proposals for, socio-cultural evolution in the city, I could see that that ideas and proposals had been made for those things. They'd been made 70, 80 years before, and they hadn't happened. There was a way that the utilitarian and the egalitarian could be intelligent and could be culturally enhancing, and the reality wasn't. The reality was shabby and mediocre and in a way disrespectful to life, and I was angry about that. And so when I was given the opportunity to make this poster, I just made the poster that I wanted to see. To be honest, it would have been better if it had been like the bus ticket that I wanted to see. But nobody was asking me to do the bus ticket at 21, okay? No one was actually asking me to do something that was the fabric of reality, but they asked me to, but I was doing a poster, so okay, so you do what you can. So that first poster for Factory was about the way I would like things to be, and that mass culture could be more intelligent and kind of enhancing to life. And that was my principle then. So from that night at the Factory, we ended up with a record label by accident, a record label for like the next 14 years. And that record label continued in the same, followed the same principles. Kind of rather stupidly, no one ever tried to make any money. And a few people got upset about that in the end. They did ask, some of the bands asked, where did the money go? But they had complete freedom. Factory Records had no contracts. There was no commitments. By the same token, there were no advances. So you didn't get given $500,000 to sign, because there was nothing to sign. And you were free, and you kept and you owned your music. So that's how Factory practiced for all of the 80s, as a kind of autonomous opportunity for everybody. And I was a founder. So there were 3 of us, and then ultimately there were 5 of us, and we were the founders of Factory Records. And so I had the same freedom as the artists. There was work to do. Nobody ever really knew what they wanted. So it was my responsibility, and at the same time my opportunity to make everything, the identity, the record covers, the look of the hacienda, the club, all of those things. I was like the default art director. I mean, I didn't do everything, thank God. In the end, other people did things. But I was like, in a way, the default art director. And there was no commercial objective. And the particular history of Joy Division and New Order meant that there was really nobody in charge. So I ended up with the freedom to make record covers that I wanted to have. So they didn't have anything to do with the music. And particularly in the case of New Order, we never talked about it. I would try, but they're not that easy to talk to. And usually, I mean, this applies with any record cover. You never really get to hear the record until afterwards. Same time the rest of the world hears it. You can visit a band in the studio. Fucking hell, you just hear like the drums of one track for 4 hours. And it's like, wow, that's really useful. So even if you've heard a demo, it never finishes like it's like that, and it's never in the sequence. Really, the experience of listening to an album from beginning to end that you're supposed to be packaging, it never really happens like that. Only like once.
Republic?
Which one?
For Republic?
Republic was like that, and that was just an accident of time. You know, they finished it in September, and it couldn't be released until after Christmas because it was not strong enough to compete in the market. So I listened to a record, and it's the only time that I did a New Order cover that was related to the music. But you know, they were doing what they felt about the now, and they were being very innovative with that in the 80s. And I was doing what I felt. I was making the visual kind of suggestions that I thought were pertinent to the moment. And they were very linked. I mean, they were linked to fashion as much as anything, and in a way to fashion cycles, and in a way the different currents that influence a zeitgeist, and that's what I was trying to tune into. So the work was about the now, and in a way that it became about the next. And it was a kind of, it was very curatorial in that sense. You know, I was curating things. Sometimes, you know, I would make the image myself with somebody, and other times I would use an image or appropriate an image or license an image. And it was very much this feeling of how I wanted, basically how I wanted things to look. That was the motivation. Then, so in that context, I had an extraordinary amount of freedom in a mass medium. I mean, at the beginning, it wasn't mass. That first poster, there was like 300 posters. But then by the time we get to Blue Monday, there's maybe 2 million copies. So that it became big. And that's not normal. That's not the job and normally of graphic design. That freedom is unprecedented. And even for me, it's unprecedented. All of the other work I've done, you have to find that that little bit of yourself within context. So it's like working to context. So you mentioned the Burberry logo, so that was the last big thing I did. There's a bit of me in that. These days, because I'm kind of like old and respected, some clients are disappointed if I can't say I like it. So the client for the Burberry logo was Riccardo Tisci, and Burberry is not really him, and Burberry is not really me. But for a couple of years, Riccardo Tisci has to make Burberry him, and he has to make himself. He has to somehow operate within that context of Burberry. And he wanted to believe that I was doing the same, that I actually liked what I showed him for Burberry. Mm-hmm. So, and other times it's not like that. Other times it's about what is right for the job, for the problem. Not what you like, and actually not what the client likes. But I said that to a client once. I said, whether you like it or not is irrelevant. This is what's right. And he didn't like that. So, but in truth, it doesn't really matter what they think. They don't have to, it just has to be right. And the difficult thing, and we'll get onto it, the next question, is if there is none of you in the work, then after a while you can't do it anymore. But with some of my work, and particularly the famous work, there is more of me than is normal. And it is because of that exceptional circumstances of factory records. And it's...
Do you regret this period?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I don't miss it because, well, the world has changed and it wouldn't mean the same now. And definitely you grow out of doing record covers, pretty quick. I mean, when you're like 20, and if something is happening in music, it's amazing because you feel very, it feels great to do it. But by the time you get to 25, it's getting a little bit adolescent. It feels it. And when you get to 30 and your friends are lawyers and artists or architects, and then it feels embarrassing, because it's like it's a little bit like you're still in school. But that said, it's the same for the musicians. I mean, it is really difficult for them. Let's see, 1980, I went to the BBC one day with Roxy Music. They were having to do like a TV show and Brian is exactly 10 years older than me. And we were doing this called Top of the Pops, the kind of chart show in Britain. And I was 25, and I thought, fucking hell, what is this awful? It was like being at a children's birthday party. And I was 25, and I thought, wow, for the band it must be horrible. Brian, particularly 35 years of age, and he's like performing to like 14-year-old girl, and I just thought, fuck. So it's much worse for them, okay? Because they never grow up. They never ever grow up. So I don't miss that bit. And I mean it's kind of strange, I mean, what happened back then in '78, the day that I went to see Tony Wilson, he worked in television and he worked at Granada Television in Manchester, and I went and I sat in the lobby of Granada Television until he came in. And I didn't know him. I knew him from TV. And he didn't know me. And I said, excuse me, Mr. Wilson, can I speak to you? And I said, you know, I'm at the art college, can I do something? And I did that poster, the yellow one, okay? And that has ended up defining my life. And I didn't know that. I mean, you never know which meeting, which thing you do one day that is going to end up shaping the rest of your career.
He was a partner? He was a client? He was
No, I mean, he was just like when Tony died, I had to do the headstone. And there was a lot of conversation, what do we write? And in the end, we wrote cultural catalyst. Tony was somebody who made things happen because he could, because he was in a position. Small cities are interesting. You can do a lot in small cities. They can be quite empowering. Big cities, in big cities, and you know, Paris is kind of medium, London is very big. You kind of feel like you're beaten before you start in big cities. You kind of think, oh, somebody else must be doing it. Whereas in small cities, you know exactly what's happening and you know who is doing it. And if it's not happening, you know it's not happening. And that was the interesting thing in Manchester. There was something that wasn't happening. There was not a venue. And there were bands that were interesting, and Tony knew it. And he had the power to do something about it. And so in that sense, the scale of a place can be quite empowering to individuals to at least try. And that's all that matters, is that you try. And sometimes in really, really big places, you don't even try because you give up before you started. Mm-hmm. So Tony was important, and he had like gravity. So people came into the orbit around Tony, and then they met other people. So ultimately, in the context of Factory, he actually didn't do anything. But without him, the system would not. So it's like the solar system. I mean, the sun doesn't actually do anything. It just sits there with a lot of energy and a lot of gravity. And then the solar system comes around it and stuff happens. And that was what Factory was like. Tony was like the sun in the middle, and stuff happened. And he had, before we leave this bit, Tony had one way of describing what we were involved in. And it used to really irritate me. He would say, it's the art of the playground. And exactly. And when I was 25, I just thought, oh, don't say that. I really did not want to be involved in the art of the fucking playground. But almost for the last 20 years, the significance of that has been really obvious, evident to me. When you reach a generation in the playground, there's a common denominator across all of them. And they're everywhere. And they're in your area, they're in your country, they're in another country, they're everywhere. And they're not yet architects or bus drivers or doctors or musicians. And they share like a common culture. It's the only time in those individuals' lives where they will share a common culture with everyone else. And usually it's music, and these days a little bit more fashion. But traditionally it's always been music. And you get everybody. you get everybody, and they share it with every single one of the others of their generation. And if you can share some new ideas and some progressive ideas with those individuals, it's the most formative time in their life, and they share it with the rest of their generation. So really, all of the big things that have changed society in the post-war period, so let's say the last 60, 70 years, they've kind of come through pop. You know, whether it's politics, gender, so whether it's Bob Dylan or Kanye West or whatever, ideas that people's parents were not sharing, and certainly the school was not talking about, or the nation was not talking about, pop culture has given that information to young people. And that's why I'm here. You know, and you got it, and there's some other people in the room who got it, and there's even some young people here who don't know it, but there's like a trickle-down effect.
Yeah. I would like to tell us about your inspiration, because you told me about the idea of the instant and now, how we still inspired by the world you live in.
Yeah, well, it was like I said just now. It was I was inspired in a way that I was angry with it, and all of the early work in the 80s was like a proposal of better. So I mean, you know, the first really important book, you know, I mentioned some books. The first really important one and the easiest one was Pioneers of Modern Typography. That's like entry level. But also it's important that it was not on the curriculum. And nobody in the 70s in the UK, nobody was talking about typography. And it was actually really boring. And I would fall asleep in typography lessons. I mean, fuck, it's boring. And it was not until later that I saw what you could do with it that was interesting. And I saw that in Pioneers of Modern Typography, and it kind of made sense to me. And in that book, I was very taken by Tischold. And so I'm looking at Jan Tischold in 1978, and I'm looking at newspapers and magazines and packaging and advertising and billboards, and I'm thinking, fuck, this stuff is terrible. The standard and the feeling of type had been lost, or it had gone into another place. And that was like the first thing. I realized that typography in communications is a little bit like hairstyling in fashion. Okay, hair is really important in a fashion picture. And it's just, if you think about it, the hair is one of the things you look at. And it tells you a lot. It tells you a lot about when is this supposed to be? What kind of story, what kind of era, what kind of vibe are they trying to communicate here? And they do, all of that's done with hair. And then the clothes kind of then complement that. And type, I realized that, wow, you can style the communication perfectly with type. And so I got into that. And all of the work, all of my thinking in the 80s was very utopian. It wasn't exactly kind of didactic, but it was definitely like ideological. It was this suggestion that things could be better. And I tried to do it for work that warranted it. You know, there was the music work, that was okay, and then in fashion I was working with Yoji, and Yoji was somebody who had values about what he did, so it was okay. And then in 1990, my world view changed. I had never been kind of political. I grew up in like a bourgeois middle class family. I always had money. My father was like a businessman, so I didn't have any angst about business. And you know, I kind of trusted the world. And then there was a recession in 1990. And between 1990 and 1992, 93, I found out things that destroyed all of my trust in establishment order. And I had experiences with banks and institutions, with the pillars of society. And they were seen to be corrupt. Hopelessly corrupt, endemically, institutionally corrupt. You know, I was not exactly bankrupt, but I was as good as bankrupt. And you learn a lot of stuff then. And when they take your home away and they take your car away, you learn stuff. And I learned stuff in 92, 93. And then, and I was at 2 years at Pentagram. They kind of looked after me for 2 years, and then they threw me out and for being difficult and not earning enough, and mainly for being difficult. And then I went to America, and I ended up, 6 months, down and out in Beverly Hills. And being broke in America that's hardcore. Fucking hell. I mean, being broke in Europe is one thing, but being broke in America is not good. And like for 6 months, I was in Los Angeles, and I had no money and no family. And when you have no money, very quickly you have no friends. Because they know you're going to come around to borrow money. So then they're out, or they're not around. Or they say, I could give you money, but what are you going to do tomorrow? So that was like I didn't enjoy it. I had to sell things to eat. And I had to go and sell personal possessions in order to make. I had a target of $20 a day cash. And it's very difficult getting cash. I'd never worked for cash. And I recommend it as an experience. Just try getting cash out of people on a daily basis. It's really difficult. And in the end, you just have to sell. You have to go to the pawn shop. You have to go places where you can sell stuff, and they give you money, and they give you very little money. And so this period in the early 90s, this changed my perspective on everything. And I began to think that it didn't really deserve to look better. That it actually was ugly. And that it was misguided to deceive people by making things better, by making the visual interface better. And by the time I was at Pentagram, I had arrived at the point where only banks, insurance companies, airlines, hotel groups, where they could actually afford me. The only people who could afford my day rate at Pentagram were the very people that you didn't want to work for. And I saw the fashion companies clustering together into groups, into conglomerates, into kind of wealth conglomerates. So the belief or the fantasy that I had about fashion as a young person, I could see that changing and becoming part of, empires like LVMH. And And so I ended up being taken by the dystopian, not the utopian. And I was helped in this one day. When would it be? It was like early 89, early 90. I had gone to Minnesota to give a talk. An AIGA chapter in Minnesota invited me to go to Minnesota to give a talk. And if I can't, these days I don't do it, but back then I know I thought I would meet girls or something. So I went. And on the way back, I was at one day in Minneapolis, and I went to the Walker Art Gallery, and it was amazing. And in the Walker Art Gallery, in the bookshop, I picked up my first Richard Prince book, which was Spiritual America. And in Spiritual America, in the kind of the warped, perceptive vision of Richard Prince, I started actually seeing the real now. Not the now how I would like it to be, but the now how it actually was. And it was so weird and fucked up that it was fascinating. So I kind of know now that most of the work I've done for the last 25 years has been based on observation, not proposal. It's gone a little bit dystopian. And it's actually a little bit more how I see things rather than how I would like them to be. Republic is the first real example of it. Yeah. That is just you have to pay the rent. With something like that, you can't go to Burberry and say, I really want to make you look bad. You have to find, I do have to do work, and I do have to earn money, and London is very expensive, and I have to pay rent. And so some things I just don't do. I don't run a studio. I don't employ any staff. I have one person who helps me manage things, and I don't use a computer. So I also do not do any graphics, any graphic process myself. So if I do a job, I have to phone a friend. I have to phone somebody. So there has to be some budget. And I do have to do something. So if it's kind of okay, then I will try to do it. So if there's a reason. So Burberry didn't happen by chance. Burberry happened because the year before, Raf Simons, who I do have a relationship with, Raf went to Calvin Klein. And now, never in a million years would the people who own Calvin, PVH who own Calvin Klein, they would never come to me. But Raf did. And Raf said, can you deal with the Calvin Klein identity for me? And because it was Raf and because I need some money, I said, yeah, I can do that. So and it was simple. The Calvin Klein identity was looking a little bit old, and I sympathized Raf had to change that. But most importantly, Raf Simons is not Calvin Klein. And Calvin Klein, upper and lowercase, was Calvin Klein the person, the same way that you write your name when you're at school. And Raf was not going to be Calvin Klein. He was going to the thing Calvin Klein. So I had to change it from the kind of the subjective to the objective. I had to just turn the Calvin Klein logo into a thing, not a person. And because I did that, then Burberry happened. Then people locally in London went, oh, maybe Peter Saville can do this. So and Burberry is okay. It's like at heart, it's like a British institution. I didn't expect the mass use that they put that logo to. I really did. But in the end, it was so much that it was kind of flattering in a way. You know, there's buildings in Shanghai covered with it, and there were buses, and there was just but endless product, where basically the logo becomes the product. And you know, and I didn't get paid for that, but it's interesting to see people basically buying a logo that happens to be a bag. But so it's kind of interesting to watch that process.
But you told me you had an opinion and an idea about Burberry till the 1987, and
yeah, that's a business side. Okay, so all right, okay, so I know what you're getting at. What Gilles is getting at there is the need to understand what you're dealing with, and when you step into a situation, don't expect the people who you're going to work for, don't expect them to tell you anything. Don't expect them to give you the information you need to respond to the situation. Basically, if you're there, you need to know. You need to know who they are, what do they do, what did they used to do, and what are they going to do next, and why. And weirdly, they will imagine you know that, because they know. And they just presume that you know. In exactly the same way that when you go to the doctor, you expect the doctor to figure some of this out for you, to just know. I mean, he will ask you, okay, how do you feel? But you expect the doctor to know the rest. And you also expect the doctor to tell you what's necessary, not to give you a list of options. It could be a cold, could be cancer. I don't know, which would you like? It does not like you expect that confidence from the doctor, and you don't expect to have to tell the doctor too much, because it's what they do. So and when you turn up with a client, you're the doctor, and you can't start asking them like, are you man or woman or whatever. It's like, well, you know. So they do expect you to know things. And how on earth can you know what to do if you don't know who they are and where they're going? So when I went into Burberry last May and saw Ricardo, I had an opinion about Burberry. I'd had an opinion about Burberry since 1987. It was a Burberry, you know, Burberry obviously make raincoats, and the raincoat was not visible in fashion in the 80s. The raincoat was not part of the fashion spectrum. And that was kind of ironic, because it you know, did rain in the 80s, but fashion was it was just too practical. It was kind of too boring to make a raincoat. So you could buy a raincoat, but you couldn't buy a raincoat that was really in the context of fashion. Also, they're not that easy to make. Like a regular clothing company can't just make a raincoat, because there's a certain technique to making them. Otherwise, they're not raincoats. And I remember when I was working with Yoji, I had said to him, and he was going to start a line called Parapluie, because he realized, anyway, it never happened. And one day in the 80s, I found some Japanese production in a sale shop. So I actually found a Burberry raincoat that was slim instead of massive. And I thought, but the sleeves were here. So I thought, wow, if Burberry just got it together, they could relaunch their business. Anyway, 10 years later, at the end of the 90s, that's kind of what happened. And Christopher Bailey went there, and there was a smart American CEO. And, you know, for the next 10 years, there was the phenomenon of the Renaissance of Burberry. And basically, it was just, all he did was make a raincoat modern, stylish. I mean, that's all he did. And everybody in the world bought a raincoat, bought a Burberry. I mean, not quite everybody, but a lot. So there was this very rapid spike in sales. Massive. The turnover at Burberry for the next 10 years was enormous. Because when you have like a utilitarian product that, a lot of people in every market buy, that's a lot of money. It's like Coca-Cola. So Burberry just had this huge exponential growth. But a raincoat is not a seasonal purchase. In fact, somebody at Burberry the other day said, it's more like a sofa. Okay, and you don't buy a new sofa every year. So that was suddenly the problem. So suddenly Burberry, it hit a peak and then it fell off. And for the last, 5-10 years, that's the problem at Burberry. Massive expectation, massive share price, growth year on year, and then suddenly, because you can't sell a raincoat every season to people. So then you have the problem of how do you turn Burberry, which is effectively a raincoat company, into either a fashion or a luxury goods company. That's their problem. And finally, Christopher Bailey had enough, and he gave up and said, I've done my bit, I'm going. So Riccardo Tisci was hired for that problem. That's what he has to do. Riccardo has to somehow turn Burberry into a luxury goods company, but not lose its essential values as a traditional, worthy, believable, trustworthy kind of British company that makes raincoats. You have to be careful doing it, because you could fail and lose everything. So you have to, and that was Riccardo's problem. And when they asked me to go in to discuss that logo problem, they had 5 days. Riccardo had turned up, and the contract and blah, blah, blah had taken up the time. And he wanted to rebrand for his first collection. And that meant, the day that I went in, it was like let's say, what's today? It's Wednesday today, okay. They needed me to go back the following Tuesday with a proposal for the logo. If he was going to get labels and invitations and signs for his first collection in time. Because it's that you can't do that stuff overnight. It takes a couple of months. They didn't need the finished logo in 5 days, but they needed him to say, okay. So there was 5 days to do it. And that's weird. Normally you'd like corporate identity, a £2 billion company is like 5 months, not 5 days. But I insisted that I talk to him, and I knew that we'd never met before, but I knew that he knew me. We had a bit of history. And he said, I went into a room like the size of this in Burberry, and every bit of archival Burberry branding and labels was out, pinned up all around. So he'd been there he'd been there a couple of days, and he had made them get everything out. He wanted to see every Burberry logo for whatever it was, 200 years. And they were like, they were confused. And it was too much information. And he sat with me and he said, Peter, he said, finding the right Burberry for a trench coat is not really a problem, is it? And we're surrounded by logos for trench coats. And I went, no. He said, the same logo in a chiffon blouse. He said, that's my problem. And I said, I know just what you mean, darling. I got it. That was the brief, and it was brilliant. It's not difficult to find the right way to write Burberry in a trench coat. That really is not difficult. But to take that same Burberry and put it in like a silk blouse, That's tricky. And the only reason I bothered saying all that is that Gilles wanted me to point out that unless you understand, unless you can make it sound like you understand the universe of the work that you're saying you can do, you can't do it. Like, you cannot, absolutely don't go into a place where you don't know who they are and what they do. They need you, they need you to understand like that what the problem is. And I did understand Ricardo's problem, and that's why 5 days later we went in with something that was not quite it, but it was on the way to it, and he could see it was on the way to it. And he got 4 or 5 other people working at the same time. So it wasn't exclusively me. But they didn't ask to see Ricardo. They didn't, and it was really important to do that. Now, when you're young and starting out, I mean, forget it. You can't do that. Also, you can't know stuff. But there are things that you are interested in, hopefully. And the things that you're interested in, other than graphics, which is boring, I'm sure some of you are interested in other things. And you have information and knowledge about those other things. Those are the places where you should think of working. Places where you're actually interested in the culture, the activity, the business, the life of those other things. Because they're things you know something about. They're things you have an opinion about. I mean, you can't really solve problems about things that you don't even have an opinion. And this is a convenient time to mention one thing. Because of all that freedom that I had in the beginning, for the next 30 years, or no, 25 years, I resented the service commitment of graphic design. I didn't really want to be a graphic designer. It was too much like being like a messenger boy. Like, you're not writing the message, you're just delivering it. And I wanted to write messages, not just deliver them. So I resented it, and that's why I never had a successful company or built an agency. I just didn't want to. I just didn't have a feeling for it. But a few years ago, I was working for my home city of Manchester. The city council rather crazily made me creative director of the city. So I was consultant. It was just like a couple of days each week. In a way, when you do those jobs, they're a little bit of every day, but formally, I was spending 1 or 2 days each week in the city of Manchester, giving my opinion about the direction of the regeneration of the city. And it was boring. And in Manchester, like in 1980, I was just like, I want to do this, I would just do it. And then suddenly, like Manchester to 2010, it's like it's not quite as many people as this, but you sit at a table in the public sector, politically, you sit at a table with 20 or 30 other people, and they all have an opinion. And everyone's opinion is equal, and they're all very important. And you get to contribute one tiny little bit, and then it doesn't happen, But so it was a very different experience. But I remember I would get on the train and go back to London at night, and I was 50, and it was like, well, God, it's really boring, but it's very grown up. It was like politics. And I would get back and I would watch the news, the TV, or the current affairs, political TV at night, and I would think, oh, that's what we were discussing today. I am very grown up. So, but then I kind of thought about it, and I thought, wow, I was actually, let's say, if it was 2010, I was 55 or something. I thought, well, I'm like 55, and like I'm part of a political discussion. And I thought, wow, how did that happen? And then I thought, like, oh, a few years ago I was doing like a sport thing. And then before that, something for like a museum or a gallery. And then before that, fashion. And then before that, music. And I thought, wow. This service profession that I have, which I thought I hated and resented its serviceness, I thought, wow. I've used, without even knowing it, it took me different places. And if I just had a more, well, I don't know what the word would be, so I'll say a less service profession. Let's just say it'd been an artist. I'd still be an artist. And that could be a bit limiting. Okay, you can try to maybe do work, but it is quite limiting. And that I suddenly had I had a positive view about the service nature of communications. That it is like a vehicle that you can go to different places. So when I was 20, 25 and wanted to do music, I could be part of music. And then when I was like 30 and wanted to be trendy and be in fashion, I could do. So that's an important thing about this for, those of you who are studying. You don't actually need to get stuck somewhere. If you're feeling a bit stuck, you can change that. It's not like working in banking and you're just like a commodity or currency exchange person. And that's it. I'm a currency exchange professional. That's it. You're actually doing something that you have a skill that you can apply to anything. But it is important to connect what you're interested in with what you are learning how to do.
Before to let the microphone to the audience, when I left you last time, you told me about a notion which is the postism.
What is it?
The postism.
Oh, postism.
Postism. I would like to
talk about postism.
Yeah, if you mind.
Okay. This is going to be. This is going to be entirely my own perspective on 50 years. Okay, but be quick. It will not be 50 years long. But it is my point of view. This is not. This is not cultural facts. It's just my point of view, my perspective on things. Because I was born in 1955, unbelievably, but it means that during the 60s, I was like between 5 and 15 in the 60s. So, all of you are older than 15, so you know what that means. Between 5 and 15, you do get to notice things. I mean, actually quite a lot, really. You're not necessarily a part of it, but you do get to notice it. So I got to notice the 60s. And they were actually, it was a very important era. A lot happened in the 60s, and I'm sure you know that. And if some of you don't know that, you should check. Because a lot of things about the way the world is now happened in the 60s. And arguably, a lot of the propositions of the early 20th century actually were delivered in the 60s. They were interrupted by 2 world wars. A lot of the promise of the early 20th century actually finally got delivered, for better or worse, in the 60s. And a lot happened in the 60s. And I was just old enough to see it, but not really be part of it. And it was very progressive. The 60s was absolutely a very forward-looking era with enormous optimism about the now and about the future. There were things happening that would change the way we lived, and for the better. So whether it was like air travel or the contraceptive pill or civil liberties or whatever, the world was looking better. And then just in 1970, 71, when I was like 16, and just like old enough to go to the party, it was like over. It was suddenly, in the early 70s, there was this very kind of morning after feeling, where so many of the things that had been hoped for didn't really work. Like the architecture was not so good for many people. And the sexual liberation, that was not so good for everybody. And the drugs, the drugs had turned out to be not so good for people. And the plastic furniture broke, and the waterbed leaked. And in the early 70s, just when I was in my late teens, it was a bit like the future's shit. It's like there was suddenly no confidence in the future. The future was suddenly scary. And it seems that when culture goes through that kind of moment, then it becomes very reflective. And then it looks back to say, did we miss something? What did we leave behind? In our rush forward, did we lose a few things? And so you get in the 70s, you get a very early fin de siècle of the 20th century. The 20th century is a very fast-moving century, and it's almost like the fin de siècle, the end of century period, almost comes in the 70s. It's manifest very quickly in architecture. And it's an architectural critic called Charles Jenks who coins a phrase for it, a term for the new reflection in architectural culture. And Charles Jenks comes up with this term, postmodernism. So as I know it, it was originally entirely an architectural term. And it was a comment on a philosophical rethinking of architectural practice after modernism. So by the end of the 60s, some of the hopes of modernism had actually appeared to prove themselves to not be entirely successful. And that the dogmatic ideology of modernism did need to be challenged. And so Charles Jenks describes the work by architects who were rethinking the now as postmodernism, basically after modernism. And there was definitely a kind of a very liberal free-form approach to architecture in the 70s. And a lot of references to history, and particularly classicism. And this term postmodernism has kind of escaped from that context out into other areas and is now used in all sorts of ways and contexts, which I freely confess to not understanding. I will not attempt to describe, postmodern philosophical thought. I'm not sure whether postmodern terms should be used to describe contemporary philosophy. I'm sure a smart person would be able to discuss that with me, but I'm not going to go there. My work, I was in exactly the same kind of state of mind. All of that early work of mine refers back to history, to things that had been left behind. So that early work of mine is entirely postmodern. But when I look at it now, and what really happened, and what has really happened since, I see it a little bit more freely now as actually just post-ism. So this kind of this affix-ism, which is attached to some kind of ideology, more even than a manifesto, it's attached to an ideology, an ism. There hasn't really been a sustained cultural ism since the 70s. Mainly because kind of socio-cultural cynicism, quite understandably, has led to a situation where nobody really believes in that anymore. Nobody really believes in these singular ideological solutions for everybody. It seems to be actually a very naive idea to propose that this is the way that you should build, and this is the way you should paint, and this is the way you dress. Market forces will challenge it, but just to even forget market forces for a moment. We just don't want everything to be the same. People don't want it, and society as it accumulates collective wisdom over the generations, society also knows that there is not one solution to all problems, and increasingly accepts that everybody is different and individual, and that there are no grand collective solutions for problems. So in a way, isms don't really apply anymore. So I tend to see it as kind of the culture of the last 40, 50 years as kind of post-ism. So the consequence of that has been, pluralism. So when people describe art, fashion, film, photography, blah, 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 these days, and even political options, it's a kind of pluralist choice. It's like a multiplex cinema. There is no fashion anymore. There is not a fashion dictate. And there used to be. Even 30 years ago, there were fashion dictates. That this color, this skirt length, this type of shirt. It seems kind of crazy now that fashion would be like that. So it's kind of, so I see it as post-ism and a pluralist condition, which, is arguably quite positive. The potential danger or conflict with pluralism is that it seemingly has given rise to the possibility of populism. So with a multiple choice scenario, and then the kind of forces that can influence popular thinking, this is where, in some cases, arguably and dangerously, some populism begins to have a chance to rise up. Because, multiple choices on offer, and then someone is able to say, wow, well, the majority want this choice. Now, to even be able to say that the majority want something is a phenomenon of, social media times. So there's lots of things happening now that they couldn't have happened before. You couldn't ever make these claims about society. You could never connect, society could never connect itself the way it does, in both good and bad ways. You know, the internet obviously is a mixed blessing for the world, and society really still has no way of knowing how to deal with it. You know, even I use it. So you know, so some old people, but all of you, you are, you know, you're the learning curve. You are the social experiment in the phenomenon of mass communications. And
you revealed the Burberry logo on the social media?
Well, Burberry did. I mean, they do everything through social media and Instagram. And I mean, I don't, you know, I don't have an Instagram account. I mean, by the time I even found out what Instagram was, it was already too passé to do it. So it was kind of fine. So by the time I thought about it, people said, oh, no, don't do that. It's not cool anymore. So I mean, I can't say I made a cool decision at the beginning. I didn't even take any notice of it. I sort of don't want to. But that's just my choice as, you know, like I'm 64 today. And to some extent, I've had enough. So I am the official old guy in the room, and quite happy to take position as old guy. You know, if I was running an agency or blah 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 and trying to make money, then it would be dangerous for me to say I'm the old guy. But I really don't care. For better or worse, I have done my bit. Some of what I did, I can see was a positive and helpful influence, and some of what I did was a negative and dangerous thing. You know, I did open, along with some other people, no, not exclusively me, but along with other people, we opened up the cultural canon to mass dissemination. And there's something good about that in like empowering visual literacy. Okay, it introduced that work to people to whom it had not been introduced before, and they liked it and they appreciated it, and other people fucked it. And other people used it to sell Vodafone text minutes and the rest of it. And in a way, naively, I didn't see that. I didn't see that coming. I did not see how business, which is entirely amoral or arguably immoral and without any conscience whatsoever, I did not see how business would have then appropriate the semiotics of the cultural canon to its own ends. I didn't see that. So I couldn't do now what I did at 25. I would say that's dangerous. Don't do that. Just leave it where it is, because the business world will destroy it. Will take away its meaning. But I didn't realize that 40 years ago. I was more trusting towards the world, and I hadn't seen how entirely lacking in any morality business was, and it still shocks me. I read there was a report in the newspaper in London on Monday how insurance companies abuse the elderly customers and the loyal customers. The loyal customers. So if you if you like have your car or your home insured with this company, if you haven't changed to another company, if you haven't shopped around and gone, they just charge you more and more because they think you're a fucking idiot. So, you know, anybody over 60, just charge them anything because they don't know, so they're idiots. But also anybody who's actually loyal. And you kind of think, I mean, how could you do that? What kind of mentality do you have? Let's sit down and say, oh, okay, who's been with us for 20 years? Okay, charge them more. I mean, that's like, how do you do that? I mean, what kind of mindset does that? Can you imagine having like a cafe and there's this nice kind of old guy and he comes every day and you say, charge him more. He's a fucking idiot. He just comes, he likes it, just charge him. I mean, like, you should be the opposite. You say, give it to him free. So I am just, it's a disgrace the way business behaves. And I have to say, the last 3 or 4 years in London, it's a disgrace the way government works. So, And I have done my bit. Wolfgang asked me to get involved in the Brexit thing, the EU thing, a couple of years ago. And there's so much, obviously, that the EU didn't get right. There was so much complacency to not, for society, for the British to vote to leave the EU, quite plainly, there was a breakdown in communications. Quite plainly. Hundreds of thousands of people in the UK did not know what the EU did for them. It just knew what it did wrong, didn't know about what was done right. So obviously there is an enormous communications remit for the EU. And there's a room full of young people and they should go and do it. I did my 10 years in government for Manchester. And it is unrewarding, but you have to do it. You do have to do it, but you don't necessarily have to keep doing it. And I have some things that I want to do for myself before I die, and I care about. That's actually what I care about now, not another project. But let's see what happens.